Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss the recent Dutch elections, where the centrist liberal D66 had a big night, while former EU bigwig Frans Timmermans and his green socialist left Labour ticket disappointed, and we're going to talk about the implications of the Dutch elections and what it actually says about the center-left and the future of European politics. Then we will turn to a conversation with Zsolt Darvish. He's a senior fellow at Bruegel, to discuss whether the EU's long-term budget, also known as the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, or MFF, is fit for purpose. We hope you enjoy the show. So let's dive in, Donatien. Dutch elections. So maybe walk us through what happened.
Yes, Dutch elections a little bit earlier than they were supposed to happen because the last ones were in 2023. But that's because the coalition that was led by Geert Wilders' party, the far-right Party for Freedom, had a very unruly coalition and it just fell apart. So therefore, new elections.
And we should say that Geert Wilders won the last election. He actually won it fairly handily as you can sort of win these kind of... I mean, there's a huge amount of Dutch parties. Like, it's totally insane how many parties there are, because most European parliamentary elections have a limit. To get into parliament, you have to get at least 4% or 5% of the vote. The Dutch elections, like, there are parties getting 1% of the vote and having one seat in the 150-seat parliament. But Wilders won last time, but no one really wanted to form a coalition with him. So they ended up forming a coalition with him.
But he was not prime minister.
But he was not prime minister. There was a technocratic person selected that was a civil servant background, Dick Schoof. And so that was the government. And it wasn't really a problem at the European level, despite a lot of concerns 2 years ago. So that's sort of more background.
Yes. And that's helpful background, but it shows that Dutch politics continue to be quite shaky. And as you were saying, there's a trillion parties. There's like 3 or 4 different, even like Christian democratic parties. So here's where we landed after the election. Is pretty, I think, kind of surprising rise or return of the center, especially the progressive D66. That stands for Democrat 66, and they were founded in 1966. They had not done that well at the previous election. And we saw this across Europe, like center, left to center progressive parties had lost a lot of juice, but really came back thanks to this really charismatic young leader, Rob Jetten. That's a good night for D66. No question there, because they also won the same number of seats as Geert Wilders' party, the Party for Freedom, which lost 11 seats in the parliament. That's a big deal for him. So it's a great night for the progressives in the center. It's a bad night for Geert Wilders. It was pretty bad as well, as you mentioned in the intro, for Frans Timmermans, because the center-left and the Greens lost more seats. They were already on a downward trajectory, and him leaving the European Union to come back to Dutch politics clearly didn't make a difference. And that was really hard for him, and he resigned that night, actually, because of this. He has a lot of support in his party, but clearly not enough support in the country. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about the center-left.
Maybe just to interject quickly, it's also worth highlighting the vote share. I mean, this shows sort of the fractured nature of Dutch politics. We've been going through the seats, but D66 got basically 17%. PVV, that was Geert Wilders, at 16.5, 16.6%. Frans Timmermans' party dropped to basically 13%. So we're talking about a very sort of fractured political landscape where you can win an election with roughly 17% of the vote and become prime minister. And so this means that they're going to be in the process of coalition building.
Yeah, and that's also the trick of a parliamentary system is I think also a lot of people maybe didn't vote, and the count for the allocation of seats, then you have to send them somewhere. So even if the turnout was pretty low, all the seats get allocated one way or another, which means if you have 17%, turns out you get 26 seats in a 150-seat assembly, we should say. So it was definitely not a good night for the center-left. Surprisingly, it was a decent night for formerly Mark Rutte's party, it's now SecGen for NATO, but the VVD, which is in the Netherlands kind of the traditional government party. That's the one that has been in many, many coalitions for the last decades. Actually did not do too bad. We were expecting a collapse of their support, and they only lost a couple seats. So the leader of that party is actually feeling quite good today. The last thing I'll say on just like who had what kind of night is it was a bad night for Geert Wilders, but it's not a bad night for the far right. That's what's really important here because his party lost 11 seats, but there are two other far right, or depends who you ask, but I think we can classify them as far right parties on the scene. So one of those parties is Ja 21, and the other one is Forum for Democracy. That's the one that we had seen really barge onto the scene with Thierry Baudet. Both of these are like, they used to be the same party, but they're both far right. And both of them gained seats. They gained more seats than the Geert Wilders party lost. So the far right on the whole did just fine that night. Geert Wilders' votes went somewhere else. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's quite important for the political landscape that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think it is important. And therefore, it's hard to sort of say, okay, far right is vanquished in the Netherlands. However, I do think that the fracturing of the far right and the fact that Geert Wilders, who had sort of gotten to this status as leading the top party in the Netherlands, got dinged and then saw his support fracture and go elsewhere is a big deal. And the fracturing of the far right also matters because I think that's sort of what we're seeing. Italy, for instance, where there's Meloni and the Brothers of Italy, but there's also Lega, I guess to their right with Salvini, very similar, but has sort of more extremist views on certain things. And so I actually think that the fracturing of the far right makes democratic coalition building perhaps easier, where maybe some of the far right parties are just maybe now right-wing parties, and maybe not far right parties. They moderate in certain areas. And so I think in general, the fact that Wilders, who broke the government, who basically is the reason why they called elections, and then got dinged for it, and then the result is that a far-right government is no longer in power. In fact, it's probably going to be a center-left government. It sort of depends on Dutch coalition building is a total nightmare because there are so many parties and you have to then try to cobble together to get to 50%. But I think there is a pathway there where it could either be a very center-left or essentially a centrist government in the Netherlands.
Absolutely. On the far right point, we've seen this in other places in Europe of far right parties getting elected or becoming first, especially in parliamentary systems, and coming into power and disappointing the voters because it's really easy to be in the opposition. But once you actually have to govern and deliver, that's where the rubber meets the road. And we've seen several of them not meet that expectation, Italy being one of the major exceptions to this. But I think that's what happened to Geert Wilders. On the coalition part, you're correct. Dutch coalition building is always a nightmare. On the official Dutch website, you can play around to see what gets you to 75 seats in the parliament. You need many. That's the tagline here. You need many, many parties.
Well, you need many, but it's not quite as bad as I think what was sort of conceived of heading into the election.
Yes, but if you do want to be solidly at least 75, you're going to need at least 5. So I didn't mention that very much, but the Christian Democrats actually did okay on election night. It's just those votes are spread a little bit. And I think what's most doable for Jetten is actually a center-right coalition that would have his party, Mark Rutte's party, well, no longer Rutte's party, and then several of the Christian Democratic parties. That gets you to exactly 75. And you could imagine they integrate the party that kind of burst onto the scene last time with the farmers' movement, lost quite a few seats, but they still have 3. So on the numbers, that would be the easiest way for him to get to 75. On the center left, he doesn't have enough. He would need to do something that goes from the center left to the center right, and there's a lot of bad blood there. But what's important is even on the center-right coalition side, there's a lot of history because the last 2 coalitions before Geert Wilders' coalition were VVD as the leader and then D66. One of them fell early and the other one took like 220 days or something to form. So it's not impossible, but it's going to take a while because there's a lot of history between those parties and a lot of personalities. But Jetten, I think, has probably the energy and the clout right now to bring these people together. The last question for me for that kind of coalition is, can they align on the economy? Because we know VVD is more on the fiscal restraint side, and can they agree by extension on EU things?
So what's about to happen now is that there's probably going to be a months-long process of coalition negotiations. Everyone should go watch the show Borgen to sort of get a dramatization of, that was in Denmark, but coalition negotiations and parliamentary systems and negotiating with small
Also for
parties.
Americans to like get a taste of what it's like to have more than 2 parties.
Yeah. And so it's messy, but let's maybe step back. What were the big issues in this election? What does this sort of mean for Europe? So what I think is interesting about D66, and it kind of came out of, not out of nowhere, but it was a big rise, is that they kind of tried to recapture Dutch patriotism. There was at the election night party, Dutch flags everywhere. Migration was obviously a topic. It is a topic. Was sort of neutralized in some degree by D66 probably taking a harder line or a kind of standard Mette Frederiksen style Danish social democratic line of a bit stronger on migration, but needing to really fix this problem. But then there was also a lot of issues like housing, other things, cost of living. What is going to be interesting for Europe is I think this is actually a big deal because Yetin gave a speech recently where he talked about effectively Europe needs to take its own defense very seriously, needs to begin the process of European defense integration, talking about essentially a European Pentagon.
And you were like, oh my God, that's my report.
Yeah, I was like, oh, wow, Max Bergman will feed you ideas. But I do think that from the Dutch, that is really a big shift. When you think Mark Rutte right now as NATO Secretary General, sort of adhering to the status quo of the NATO alliance, and now you have a Dutch prime minister, the first big Western European election since the German election, the election was taking place before the inauguration. This is sort of a big significant election in that I think that this indicates sort of a movement or potential movement toward more energy in the EU's efforts on defense and in thinking through that. So I think this will be significant to have a pro-European, pro-EU Dutch leader. They haven't had that. I mean, Mark Rutte was not in that camp. He would play hardball on certain things when it came to EU budget.
Mr. No.
Mr. No. But all the European leaders liked him. He wasn't going to be extremely unreasonable, but he was going to be a hard negotiator and wasn't inclined. They were the leaders of the frugal group of
during
states.
COVID, like package negotiation, he was a massive hurdle. Whereas Yetin brings so much pro-European ambition.
So I think that will be a big source of energy. And it sort of counteracts the Czech elections with Andrej Babiš, and they look like they're going to have a very Eurosceptical government. So it sort of balances that out, I think, that creates some degree of energy. Maybe just lastly to talk about the center left, because Frans Timmermans was a very senior commissioner in the previous von der Leyen cabinet, led the Green Deal, came back to Dutch politics. And what's happened is that the socialists have merged with the Greens in the Netherlands to try to form kind of the center left bloc, because both the Greens and the socialists were really down and out. And there was sort of a revival, I think, last time. They got 25 seats in 2023 and just 20 this time. Really, their thunder was stolen by D66. And I think it leads to broader questions of what is the center left about in Europe? It's not just about in the Netherlands, but also with the SPD in Germany, which, they suffered because Olaf Scholz was not that popular, terrible coalition, all of that. But it's also hard to see, what is the actual agenda? And I want to say specifically when it relates to Europe, I saw recently that Stefan Löfven, the former Swedish prime minister, also of the Social Democrats, is actually the head of the Party of European Socialists. And I was sort of scratched my head because I don't think of Stefan Löfven as being very pro-EU. In fact, he was governing in a very Eurosceptic, I would describe, sort of way, which makes sense in a Swedish political sense. But I get no sense from the center left that they have any real vision or agenda for what they want from Europe. You hear rhetoric from Merz, from the center right at times, from Manfred Weber and others talking about a European army. But from the center left, what does the center left want from Europe? Is it more Erasmus programs? What is their positive vision for Europe? And I think this is a problem because what you get is a negative vision about Brussels regulation from the far right and Brussels being bad on migration and all these other things. But there's no sort of, the center left is going to argue for X, Y, and Z at the European level, or wants the EU to provide fast trains between Rotterdam and wherever. But there isn't a plan or agenda, or I sort of just feel like the center left is like, we like Europe, great. But they're not really articulating Draghi report, competitiveness, not that that would play, but there isn't necessarily an agenda there. And they're not even really leveraging the kind of anti-Trump sentiment that you think we need to stand up for Europe and European strategic autonomy, and we need to be able to stand on our own because we can't rely on Donald Trump. I don't think that was a real message in this election.
No, the center left is not doing that. Also because the center right is doing it as much as they can. And the challenge for the center left is that on their left, they're also getting out-lefted, especially when it comes to the European Union. There are a lot of further left parties that talk about the European Union as a neoliberal project. And they're getting support from the base on that. The center left can't play on that turf. Because one, they don't necessarily agree ideologically. They were part of the architects of what the EU looks like, and they continue to support the big files in Brussels the way they are now. So they can't really run against it that much. They can't go further left because they're getting their lunch eaten on that side. But they also, as you were saying, I agree 100%, they don't have an active positive vision for it because they don't know where to place themselves on that spectrum. And even though there's a lot to be talked about, we could invest a lot more to support housing, etc. But also von der Leyen is kind of talking about these things, especially on housing and like transportation. So it's hard for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where D66 being more of the liberal, small L liberal centrist, like can really carry the EU mantra. And maybe one final thought is about the Greens. And I think this is a real challenge for the Greens because it was the Socialists and the Greens were part of Timmermans' coalition. I think the Greens also in Germany didn't do that well in the last election. And the Green parties in general are sort of struggling, except in the UK. But the Green agenda, the Green Deal got implemented or got passed. There's always more to do. But if that is like your raison d'etre, and now there's sort of inevitable backlash to getting most of your agenda implemented, where do the Greens sort of go from here? And I think that is a big question that I have. And maybe we should talk to some Green thinkers about where they're headed, because it strikes me that they could steal some of the pan-Europeanness that we see from D66 that isn't quite shared by the center left. The Greens are a bit more flexible. They're moving to the center at times or moving in different directions. But I think that reflects the kind of messy nature of European politics right now, particularly when you look to the left side of the spectrum. But with that, I think let's pivot to talk about the very exciting topic of the European budget. It's maybe not that exciting, but it's very important. Budgets are important. Budgets determine priorities, and we're going to get in the weeds in the next conversation.
We're thrilled to welcome Zsolt Darvas to the Eurofile. Zsolt is a senior fellow at Bruegel and a part-time senior research fellow at the Corvinus University of Budapest. His research interests include macroeconomics, international economics, central banking, and time series analysis. Zsolt, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start big picture to try to help our listeners wrap their heads around the multi-annual financial framework, or the MFF, or the 7-year budget for the European Union. Can you help us understand what it is, why it's 7 years, and why we are starting negotiations for it in 2025 for the one that starts in 2028?
The European Union and its predecessors, like the European communities, and even earlier in the 1950s, the so-called coal and steel community, established a budget for common spending, which was initially for each year up to the 1980s. But as the EU budget took up more and more roles, it became more and more difficult to agree on what the EU should spend on. And having a budget negotiations every year was, very time consuming. So in the 1980s, the leaders of the European Union decided to launch multi-year budget. The very first one was 5 years long. And ever since then, the European Union multi-annual budget lasts for 7 years. It means that there is an agreement on what the budget will look like in the subsequent 7 years. And obviously it is broken down into annual budgets. But once the 7-year budget is agreed, the process of specifying each year budget became much simpler. And this meant that these major negotiations now took place in every 7 years and not in each year. So it saves a lot of time. But these negotiations are very, very time consuming. So they can take up to 2-3 years. So that's why the European Commission makes an initial proposal about 3 years before the end of the particular multi-annual budget for the next multi-annual budget. And this is what just have started now. So the European Commission made a proposal in July this year for the next 7-year budget starting in 2028. And currently this proposal has been made, and now the negotiations are ongoing between various institutions and EU member states on how to modify the proposal of the European Commission.
Zsolt, what is your take on the time frame? I mean, right now I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Our government is shut down because of a lapse in the appropriations, a failure to agree on the budget. Now, most countries, they just continue with last year's budget and you don't actually have a government shutdown the way we do. So I could see negotiating a budget every year. That's very difficult. It's time consuming, even every 2 years. But 7 years strikes me as a very long time because stuff happens. The previous negotiation for the multi-annual financial framework for the 7-year budget, Russia had not invaded Ukraine. There was no real focus, or a very limited focus essentially on defense. It was in there. But a lot can change in 7 years. And so I'm curious how you see that time frame. I mean, it seems like there's no real negotiation in Brussels about whether they should shorten it or adjust that. And what happens if new things happen over the course of the 7 years? How can the EU react if its budget is set so far in advance?
So let me answer the question by highlighting two key issues. The first one is that the European Union budget is very limited. It amounts to about 1% of GDP, gross domestic product of the European Union, while each country in the EU spends about 40 or some even more than 50%, more than half of their gross domestic product. So clearly the EU budget is very, very small. And this means that most of public spending in the Union are done by national governments. And these national governments have budgets from year to year, and obviously they respond whatever new thing happened. This also means that this 7-year EU budget should really focus on spending categories for which European involvement really makes a value added, because just doing something which EU countries can do by themselves, the same level of efficiency, for example, or cost effectiveness, wouldn't make sense to the European Union level. But my second point is that still, even within this limited budget, there is a degree of flexibility. For example, when Russia attacked Ukraine, and after that energy prices skyrocketed, then some unused funds from here and there were rechanneled to new measures addressing the impact of high energy prices. Again, this was not big amounts, but some amounts. And for the next 7-year budget, the European Commission even proposes a greater degree of flexibility for allowing the possibility of easier reprogramming whenever a new shock would hit the European Union.
The point you made on focusing where the EU has value add is really interesting, and I want to get to that in a second. But since you just mentioned flexibility, this seems to be a big theme for the Commission this time with their proposal, with some flexibility instrument included in the proposal that they made. What amount of flexibility is there right now in the MFF? And what do you see as the possibilities for the future? And since you mentioned the budget is quite small, how much flexibility do you think there needs to be anyway?
So in the current EU budget, the flexibility is somewhat limited, partly because most of the budget, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, said that about 90% of the budget has been pre-allocated to EU countries. So it means that, for certain specific programs and projects, it has been determined in advance, how much Germany, how much Luxembourg, how much Malta is going to get. And this means that, if a new shock hits the European Union and some additional EU spending would be needed, then, it's very difficult to move funds away, let's say, from Germany to France or from Malta to Luxembourg. So the flexibility in the current budget is limited, but it's still there. So first of all, within countries, so countries have some room for proposal for revisions. For example, if they set out a program for 7 years, but in the meantime, they find out that this program is not useful anymore or not effective enough, or there are more prominent issues to spend on, then they can submit a request for revision. And then if it is approved, then they can use the money for different things. Also, in the EU budget, even though countries plan to spend all the amounts they get, they can't do that always. And there are always some leftovers from different projects, which money is either not used at all, or it can be reallocated to other purposes. And currently, this is the case. So if there are some unused funds from a certain project or instrument, then that can be reallocated to other purposes. Now, the Commission aims to achieve a much greater degree of flexibility in the next multi-annual framework. Also, they aim to reduce very significantly the amount which is pre-allocated to EU countries. Now we need to see how the negotiations will evolve and whether EU members will agree to that.
So going back to this idea of focusing where there is value add and connecting to what you just said, obviously countries have stated interests in getting pieces of that budget, but we're seeing a lot of different opinions these days on the value that the EU brings. And some countries have higher demand for what could be considered EU public goods. Others think the budget should not move. How do you see things proceeding when it comes to the different demands that are being put on this budget? Is there actually a prospect for a real increased ambition in the next few years, given what we know of some of the larger member states and not all of them agree? And are there specific geographical differences that you see in this? I'm just curious what kind of tug of war we're likely to see.
Let me start by clarifying what we understand by European public goods. So, in general, a public good is something which is not provided by the market in sufficient amount, and consumption, its use cannot be excluded. For example, police or army or border control are very typical public goods. Market individuals would not provide it. But if it's provided by the state, then it can be used by everyone. Nobody can be excluded from the benefit of secure borders. This is a general definition of public good, but in order to have a European public good for the European Union, it must have some European dimension. For example, either it should be more efficiently provided together. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine procurement was centralized, and the European Union could have a bigger bargaining power with the vaccine providers and could secure larger amounts at cheaper prices than if all the 27 countries would have done the same thing together. So either there should be an economies of scale and cost efficiency, or there should be very significant cross-border implications of, let's say, what Germany does. If it has a major implications for France, either positive or negative, then it's better to do together, because then in this case, these cross-border impacts can also be taken into consideration. And it's also very important for such European public good to have a common interest, so a shared understanding that this is important. Because let's say if Germany thinks that providing something important, but France thinks it is not at the European level, then obviously we are at a point when there is no agreement. Now, in the current EU budget, about 1/3 of spending is spent for agriculture and mostly agricultural subsidies. And another third of the European Union budget is spent on so-called cohesion, namely helping poorer regions and countries to grow and converge to the average European standards. Recent research analyzed whether these two major spending items align with this concept of European public goods. And for agriculture, we concluded that it is not, because agriculture is mostly subsidies to farmers to provide them a better life. But this is more a social policy. So we don't see any particular European value added by using European money to subsidize farmers in each country. So I think a good solution that we have proposed is to remove agricultural subsidies from the European Union budget and move it to national budgets. But unfortunately, EU member states don't want to hear about it. And, if this is the case, this means that the room for maneuver, for spending more on other things, have much more limited. In the current proposal of the European Commission, there was a suggestion to reduce the share of agricultural subsidies and cohesion spending from about 2/3 to about 45%, meaning that more will remain for other priorities. For example, competitiveness is a top priority at the moment. Defense is also a priority. Support for border control and immigration control is also a top priority. But how much actually can be spent is indeed based on the overall size of the EU budget. And many EU members now face tight fiscal positions. They have to do fiscal adjustment at home. So they don't really want to see an increase in the overall size of the European Union budget. So the European Commission, seeing this reality, proposed only a minor increase from 1.1% of GDP to 1.26% of GDP, so a relatively limited increase. Even I heard from many member states that they regard this increase excessive and they want to cut back. Moreover, a large share of this increase will be used for servicing EU debt, which was borrowed during the pandemic to fund the EU Pandemic Recovery Fund. So actually, even in the Commission proposal, even though the overall size increases a little bit, actual spending beyond interest and repayment of debt would increase very, very limited way. And I'm afraid that EU members might even cut back this proposal. So to answering your question, I'm afraid that there is a very limited increase and there might be even a decline as a share of GDP of how much the EU actually spend on various priorities beyond servicing its debt.
It seems like the current budget politics that sort of no one is happy. It seems that those that are advocating for more EU public goods, for a larger EU budget, were quite disappointed with the Commission's proposal for not being ambitious enough, for not asking even more of member states. And then, as you noted, that there's this sort of big pushback happening from various countries, from the agricultural industries, from the regions that are nervous about more national control and losing some of their budget share. So everyone seems very upset. Yet, as you note, there's this problem of Europe needs to spend more on defense, needs to do more on energy. It now has debt servicing, and there isn't a lot of talk about rolling over the debt, creating a safe asset, which perhaps would be one way to minimize some of the budget impact. But I'm curious, there's this other aspect of own resources, the quote unquote own resources, of the EU's ability to raise revenue itself. Right now, the president here in the United States is very keen to point out how much revenue is coming in from the increase in US tariffs. And I'm curious if there are other ways that the EU is eyeing to bring in more revenue, and if that's a potential way of gaining more revenue. Now, EU-wide taxation is probably not on the table. That would sort of be a real movement toward fiscal union. But maybe you could elaborate. Are there ways that the EU could perhaps look at increasing the amount of own resources that it has?
So let me clarify the notion of own resources, which for a native speaker might sound a very weird expression because the EU doesn't have resources which it actually owns. I mean, you might say that, for example, competition policy fines, which are imposed by the European Union Competition Authority, is a kind of own resource. But beyond that, and also beyond other fines imposed by European Union institutions, there is nothing really what the EU actually owns. All of these resources, all of these revenues to the EU budget are paid by European Union countries from the national budget. They transfer to the European Union budget. Still, the EU jargon uses this expression own resources, which I find misleading, but anyhow, this is just a jargon. But coming back to the main issue of your question, also I'm afraid that this debate on generating new EU revenues is somewhat misleading because, as you rightly said, the European Union does not have a tax-raising power. So the European Union cannot impose taxes on European Union citizens or businesses or whoever. Anything which comes to the EU budget, first of all, have to be approved unanimously by all 27 EU countries. And all of these revenues are actually coming from the 27 EU countries. So if there is a new so-called own resources found and the 27 agrees, still the 27 member states will pay that into the EU budget. For example, let me mention one resource which has been created in 2021, so the beginning of the current 7-year framework. This is called Non-Recycled Plastic Waste Levy. So there are data on how much plastic waste are there in each European Union countries and what share is recycled and what share is not recycled. And based on what is not recycled, EU members pay a contribution to the EU budget. But again, this is coming from the national budget. So budget from Germany, from France, from Spain, from Poland, and so on. So calling it an own resource is misleading. It is paid by national member states. So if any new own resources will be found, those will also be paid by member states. And the Commission made several proposals. They made proposals based on tobacco consumption and production. Again, if EU members approve, this will be paid by national governments to the EU budget. There was a proposal on non-collected electronic waste. So if there are computers or mobile phones or any other electric equipment which have been not collected after they have been scrapped, then again, EU countries would need to pay more. Also, the European Commission proposed transferring some of the revenues from the so-called emission trading system of the European Union, which means that whenever a company wants to emit CO2 or other harmful substances, then it has to purchase a permit to do that, which has a market price. And from that, EU countries have revenues, and the Commission proposed channeling some of these revenues to the European Union budget. Also, there is a new proposal on the table, a so-called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will penalize those imports which were produced in their source countries under high carbon emissions. Again, those revenues would go to the national budgets, but the Commission proposed to channel some of them to the European Union budget. I could continue So in the end, it will be EU members paying either one way or the other. So irrespective of whether new own resources would be introduced, ultimately EU members will foot the bill.
Maybe one final question. So this budget doesn't take effect until 2028. So what's going to happen over the next few years? Let's just hypothesize there's going to be elections in Hungary, for instance. Perhaps Orban is no longer the prime minister. Maybe there's a real shift in thinking about enlargement towards Ukraine. Are there big movements that you could see happening on this budget? I mean, right now it feels very much sort of status quo, not much changing from the previous budget. It's going to be hard to get more revenue. The sense that I'm getting from you is the next EU budget will look a lot like the last EU budget. But are there things that could emerge that change that? And how do you see this sort of playing out?
In some sense, there is little change compared to the previous budget. But in terms of the organization of the budget and the budgeting process, the European Commission has proposed some notable changes. For example, they want to reduce very, very substantially the number of programs in the EU budget. They want to reduce very substantially the so-called headings, which are the main spending items. I mean, this might sound somewhat technical, but they still have a major implication because the new budget will be structured in 3+1 pillar, according to the Commission proposal. And the first pillar will merge agricultural policy, cohesion policy, immigration policy, and a few others. And EU countries would need to prepare a major so-called regional partnership plans. And these comprehensive plans will have to include all of these policy areas from agriculture to cohesion to migration. And presumably, this might give a bigger role to central governments in planning how this money would be spent. So that will be a major change. And also the Commission aims to move away from financing against invoices toward financing against results, which a topic itself would deserve a full podcast, so I wouldn't go into details. But this change in budgeting method would also involve a big, big change. The Pillar 2 of the Commission proposal will be a so-called European Competitiveness Fund, which would merge several of the previous instruments of the previous European Union budget, which again might sound a bit technical, but if approved, then it could lead to a significant reduction in the administrative burden because according to the plan, this European Competitiveness Fund will have a single rule book. Like currently, the different funds have different rule books. So if anyone would like to apply for EU funding, they have to go through all the specific requirements of each EU funds, and that could be very burdensome. And the third main pillar would be global action. There might be more limited changes there. So even if the Commission proposal at the overall spending level wouldn't plan a big increase, it still planned some reshuffling away from agriculture and cohesion toward more for competitiveness. And the budgeting method is proposed to change, which I think would be a major change. Now, what could happen in the next 2.5 years? Again, with my interaction to national representatives, they're very, very unhappy about this proposal for many different aspects. So what I expect is that the proposal would be watered down and could be moved closer to the current multi-annual budget, which in my view would not be an optimal solution because even though the Commission proposal could have been improved, at least it tried to make some changes. But if EU members insist on the status quo and would allow very limited changes, then unfortunately you will be fully right that the next 7-year budget will be very similar to the current one. And you also asked about Ukraine and other possible enlargements of the EU, which is indeed on the table. However, whenever any new country joins the European Union, then there are relatively long transition periods during which the new member would not fully benefit from the EU budget. For example, if you look at the 2004 enlargement, when 10 countries joined the EU, mostly from Central and Eastern Europe, there were very long transition periods during which these countries get limited funding from the European budget. And, just by the end of, let's say, a 10-year period, they became a full beneficiary as other Western European countries. So presumably, if Ukraine or any other country would join the EU, similar transition periods would be put in place, meaning that these countries will have to wait a long, long time until they can fully benefit from the EU budget. And also, I'm afraid EU enlargement is still somewhat far off, several years from now. So in my view, the next EU enlargement, which by the way, I very much endorse the enlargement of the EU, but this will have rather limited implications for the next 7-year European Union budget.
Well, Joel, thank you so much. That was a great overview and deep dive into the EU budget. Köszönöm szépen. Thank you for being here on the Eurofile, and we hope to speak again soon as the EU budget process plays out over the next few years.
Thank you very much for having me here.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.